cover the history of Texas cannabis laws from 1919 to 2023. From early prohibitions to recent reforms, the legal landscape of cannabis in the Lone Star State has been a complex and evolving story. Join me as I dive into the key moments, influential people, and the ongoing debate that has and is shaping the cannabis laws in Texas. Era number 1, the early prohibition, 1919 to the 1960s. In the early 20th century, Texas, like many other states, began to criminalize cannabis. Cannabis use became illegal in Texas in 1919. The state legislature passed a law that year that made the possession of loco weed, a term used for cannabis at the time, a felony offense. This move was part of a broader trend across the United States during the early 20th century, where many states were enacting laws to criminalize the possession and use of cannabis. The criminalization in Texas was influenced by a combination of factors, including but not limited to racial prejudices, societal fears, and misunderstandings about the effects of the plant. The law was also reflective of a nationwide movement that eventually led to the federal prohibition of cannabis with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. As in Texas, across the USA, the 1920s saw the first laws against the possession and sale of marijuana. Why did politicians and anti-cannabis activists use the terms they use? Let's take a look. The use of terms like marijuana, weed, or pot instead of cannabis when criminalizing the possession of the plant has historical and socio-political roots. First of all, racial and cultural associations. The term marijuana became popular in the United States during the early 20th century and was often associated with Mexican immigrants. By using this term, some politicians and media outlets were able to create a connection between cannabis and minority communities, fostering fear and misunderstanding. This association played a role in the criminalization efforts. 2. Sensationalism and propaganda. The use of colloquial terms like weed or pot helped to sensationalize the perceived dangers of cannabis. During this era of reefer madness and similar anti-cannabis campaigns, these terms were used to create alarming narratives that portrayed cannabis as a dangerous and immoral substance. Number 3, distancing the medical use. The scientific term cannabis was well known in the medical community during this time, and the plant had been used for various medicinal purposes. By using different terminology, politicians and anti-cannabis activists could distance the plant from its medical applications and emphasize its recreational use, which was portrayed negatively. And the 4th reason, emphasizing criminality. By using slang or colloquial terms like pot, weed, or marijuana, lawmakers were able to emphasize the criminal aspect of cannabis possession and use. This linguistic choice helped to create a distinction between the legal medical use of the plant and the illegal recreational use. In summary, the choice of terminology was not accidental, but a strategic effort to shape public perception, align with cultural biases, and support the political agenda of criminalizing cannabis. It reflects the complex interplay of racial, cultural, and political factors that influenced the legal status of cannabis during the 20th century. These laws were often racially motivated and targeted the black and brown minority communities as another tool to use in the Jim Crow laws era of our country. Historian James T. Campbell said, "The laws against marijuana were not about the drug itself, but about controlling certain populations." During the 1960s, the penalties became even more severe, reflecting the nationwide trend and the movement toward Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Era number 2, the push for reforms, the 1970s to the 1990s. With the nation of teens and college students protesting and over 500,000 young Americans serving in Vietnam, President Richard Nixon officially declared the war on drugs on June 17, 1971. At the same time as he was pulling troops out of Vietnam in an apparent loss, facing questions brought up by the revelation of the Pentagon Papers and a slumping economy. Some historians believe the war on drugs was an attempt by Nixon to distract from his other shortcomings and shore up support from his conservative base. Let's take a look at 4 ways the war on drugs affected the cannabis plan. Number 1, increased penalties. Nixon's war on drugs led to harsher penalties for drug offenses, including cannabis possession and distribution. This included longer prison sentences and substantial fines, making the legal consequences of cannabis-related activities more severe. This is why you see some defendants in certain states serving life sentences for small amounts of cannabis possession. This, of course, affected the black and brown communities more harshly. Number 2, the creation of the DEA. In 1973, Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration, consolidating several existing agencies into one. The DEA's focus on enforcing drug laws included those related to cannabis, led to increased arrests and prosecutions, reflecting a more aggressive approach to drug control. 3, and maybe one of the biggest, scheduling of cannabis. Under the Controlled Substance Acts of 1970, cannabis was classified as a Schedule I substance, the most restrictive category. This classification asserted that cannabis had a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, making any possession, distribution, or production a federal crime. And 4, a shift in the focus of funding. The war on drugs marked a shift from treating drug use primarily as a public health issue to treating it as a criminal justice issue. More resources were allocated to law enforcement and incarceration rather than treatment and prevention, leading to a more punitive approach to cannabis and other drugs, and in my humble opinion, has led to our mental health crisis our country currently has in 2023. All of these policies marked a significant shift in the U.S. government's approach to drug use and had lasting impacts on the legal and cultural landscape, not only in the United States and Texas, but around the world as well. The latter half of the 20th century marked the beginning of a slow shift towards reform in Texas, though. In 1970s, some Texas cities, such as Austin, decriminalized small amounts of marijuana, reflecting a growing awareness of the social and economic cost of prohibition. This was not a legalization of cannabis, only a shift towards more lenient penalties for possession or use of the plant. This is really no different than a police officer letting you drive 75 miles per hour in a 60 mile per hour speed zone. Many cannabis activists have shifted the conversation to one of personal freedom versus one of drug use or abuse. Cannabis advocacy proponents like Keith Stroup, an attorney and the founder of NORML, played a crucial role in this era. Stroup once stated, "We're not just talking about a drug, we're talking about personal freedom." Era number 3, the medical cannabis movement. The 2000s and the new millennium brought a renewed focus on the potential medical benefits of cannabis around the country, with many states legalizing medical cannabis use and setting up patient programs for state government regulations and tax collection. While Texas has been slow to adopt medical cannabis laws, the Compassionate Use Act of 2015 marked a significant milestone, allowing low THC cannabis for specific medical conditions. Now here's where many people get confused about the Texas cannabis laws and the 3 points you need to know. Number 1, yes, we do have a medical cannabis patient program in Texas with 3 growers, 3 processors, and 3 dispensaries in the entire state that includes just over 30 million people. This was true in 2015 and it remains true in 2023. And these for the license and $100 for each site grown at, and grow hemp flower with nearly the same amount of Delta-9 THC content in it. That takes us to the second misunderstood fact about Texas cannabis laws. When they say low THC cannabis, they really mean it. At 0.05%, there is barely any noticeable THC in the plant, and actually probably not enough to serve as a medicine, and certainly not enough to cause any psychoactive effects or a high if that's what you were looking for. In comparison, legal hemp under the 2018 Farm Bill can have up to 0.03% Delta-9 THC. So Texas Compassionate Use Act is relatively a law that allows the use of hemp products which are already available to any citizen of the state of Texas. You can actually legally buy THCA in Texas CBD shops that when heated becomes Delta-9 THC and will be far more potent in every aspect than the Texas Compassionate Use cannabis. Curious about THCA? Watch our next video on THCA for more info on this compound and how it relates to THC. And the third misunderstood fact about the Compassionate Use Act of 2015 is that it initially allowed for the use of low THC cannabis oil or tinctures, but not smokable flower or concentrates, for the treatment of intractable epilepsy only. What is intractable epilepsy? Intractable epilepsy is diagnosed when someone has had years of uncontrolled seizures. This means medication no longer works well enough to control their episodes, and their seizures are frequent, severe, and affecting their quality of life. Just for data's sake, it's estimated that 1/3 of epilepsy patients have intractable epilepsy. So for some general numbers, in the United States, it's estimated that around 1% of the population have epilepsy. So with a population of around 29 million people in Texas as of 2015, this would translate to roughly 294,000 people with epilepsy. If 1/3 of those cases were intractable, the estimated number with intractable epilepsy in Texas would be around 96,000, thus making medical cannabis available to only 96,000 of the nearly 29 million Texas residents with medical cannabis needs. This was a very limited step by Texas lawmakers to appear to be compassionate and gain political points, while not really moving the medical cannabis ball forward, as it did not include other medical conditions that are recognized in some other states with medical cannabis programs. The law was focused on providing an option for patients with intractable epilepsy who had not found relief with traditional treatments, a total of approximately 96,000 potential patients in Texas. Since the initial passage of the Compassionate Use Act in 2015, there have been efforts to expand the program to include additional conditions. Subsequent amendments have indeed broadened the list of qualifying conditions, but the original 2015 law was specific to intractable epilepsy. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who signed the Compassionate Use Act, said, "There is no credible evidence to suggest that legalizing marijuana would make it any less of a threat." This statement reflected the cautious, maybe uneducated approach Texas took toward medical cannabis in 2015. Notice he still refers to it, even in a government statement, with a slang term, marijuana, versus using the scientific name for the plant, cannabis, showing the true fear of the power of the cannabis plant for medical use. And era number 4, recent reforms and future prospects. The last decade has seen growing momentum for cannabis reform in Texas, with even many conservatives, such as Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller, saying in 2022, "It's time for all of us, including the governor, members of the Texas legislature, and others to come together and set aside our political differences to have an honest conversation about cannabis, where we have been, where we are going, and what role government should properly play." He continued with, "I have seen firsthand the value of cannabis as medicine to so many Texans." Mr. Miller is the highest-ranking Texas official to publicly support the medical use of cannabis in the state of Texas. Bills to decriminalize possession and expand medical access have been introduced, reflecting a changing public opinion. In 2021, House Bill 1535, signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott, increased the allowable THC level in medical cannabis products from 0.5% to a full 1%. This change expanded the options for medical cannabis products available to patients in the state's program. The second reform is the same bill also expanded the list of qualifying medical conditions for medical cannabis use. In addition to intractable epilepsy, the updated list includes epilepsy, a seizure disorder, multiple sclerosis, spasticity, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, autism, cancer, post-traumatic stress disorder, and incurable neurodegenerative diseases. The bill also called for the establishment of a medical cannabis research program to study the safety and efficacy of medical cannabis for various conditions. Currently in 2023, proudly Texas is one of 15 states that allows the import-export of hemp-derived products under the 2018 U.S. Farm Bill, allowing for the production, processing, and distribution of products with a Delta-9 THC content under 0.03%, which most, if not all, fresh cannabis plants will fall under this threshold until aged or heated. Advocacy groups and politicians alike have voiced support for these reforms. Representative Joe Moody, a leading advocate for decriminalization, stated, "This is about smarter use of resources and smarter justice." Before we move on to our conclusion, if you find this content valuable and want to stay updated on the latest development, please click the subscribe button below. Your support helps us continue to provide in-depth insights and analysis of the Texas cannabis scene and beyond. In conclusion, the history of Texas cannabis laws is a complex mix of social, political, and cultural factors that even many of our current politicians have acknowledged. From early prohibition, whose aim was to most likely oppress minorities, to the current push for medical cannabis reform, the journey of cannabis in Texas, although slow and possibly the last state to get on the train, reflects the broader national trends and the ongoing debate over personal freedoms, public health, and social justice. As we look to the future, the path towards the further reform remains uncertain, but I personally feel filled with great potential. The voices of politicians, advocates, and everyday Texans like yourself will continue to shape the destiny of cannabis in the Lone Star State. And Canna Texas Chronicles plans to be there to document it all. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. Stay informed, stay engaged, stay terped up. I'll see you in the next video on THCA Uncovered. Top 3 facts you need to know today.